Hi, I'm so excited today to be talking to Dr. Michael Berenbaum. He's a renowned Holocaust scholar, a museum creator, and an author and editor for at least 20 books. He's directed the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, led the Shoah Foundation's collection of 50,000 survivors' testimonials, and has produced and advised on Oscar-winning films. Welcome, Dr. Berenbaum. It is so nice to meet you and to be having a conversation with you.
Thank you for having me.
When I read about the NEA, the largest teachers union, deciding to remove the word Jewish and Jews from mention of the Holocaust, I run a Substack with my brother. He's an author and I'm an artist. And he wrote an article about the NEA doing this. And I wanted to find out more about it and the topic. And I felt like you would be the perfect person because of your background.
Well, let's start with a very simple thing. To remove the word Jew from the Holocaust is ahistorical and it politicizes history. And let me tell you why. Um, the Holocaust, let's start back at very basics. The Holocaust came into usage only in the 1950s and 60s. Prior to that, it was a crime without a name. Winston Churchill once called it a crime without a name. In the Germans described the what we now know as the Holocaust as the final solution to the Jewish question, the Endlösung. And what they meant by that is they were, in one sense, telling the truth. If you murder all the Jews everywhere, then in a very real sense, it's the final solution. No more Jews, no more Jewish problem. The Jews who went through it called it the Churban, the destruction, representing the destruction, first temple, the second temple, the flames. Holocaust came into use much later. To take the Jews out of the story and not use the Jews is not to understand what happened. What happened ultimately was reflected as persecution gave way to what shall we to expulsion. And when expulsion did not work, you had two stages of the killing process. You first sent mobile killers to stationary victims, and that we call the Holocaust by bullets. It was called the Einsatz Group in the mobile killing units, but it also involved regional killing by, for example, the Jews who were killed in Lithuania. 2 out of 3 were killed by Lithuanians. 60% of the Jews in Latvia were killed by Latvians. 100% of the Jews in Estonia were killed by Estonians, not Germans. When that became a problem for the killers, it's not easy to go out and murder people every day, apparently, to shoot them, men, women, and children. They reversed the process. They took the concentration camp and made it into a murder camp. And they made the victims mobile and the killing process stationary. But the people who were murdered in the death camps by gassing were overwhelmingly Jewish. And essentially in Auschwitz, Jews were murdered in gas chambers, probably in the neighborhood of 1.1 million Jews and some 19 to 23,000 Roma and Sinti gypsies, and probably a couple of thousand Soviet POWs. So how do you speak about them? And in Treblinka, 925,000 Jews were killed between the 23rd of July and the 4th of August, 23rd of July, 42, the 4th of August, 43. Of the 925,000 killed and murdered in Treblinka, you probably had 2,000 who may or may not have been Jewish. Of the 500,000 Jews killed in 10 months in Belgium, 99 and 99 100% were Jewish. So how do you eliminate the word Jewish from the Holocaust? Who are the victims? And the NEH, which is supposedly a teachers organization that wants to teach truth and credibility, you're going to ask the sense is to eliminate the victims uh, and not to describe the victims. Now, that's not something that any organization should do. And that is part of what we have called traditionally Holocaust denial. Soviet Union started that when they used to speak of the murder of citizens of a state. If you went to the original exhibition at Auschwitz, you had an exhibition on the murder of Austrians from Austria, of Hungarians from Hungary, of citizens of Germany. Now, they didn't murder German citizens, they murdered Jews. They didn't murder Hungarian citizens, they murdered Jews. They didn't murder, Austrian citizens, they murdered Jews. If you don't use the Jew word, the JEW word, you're lying about the past.
I want to really try to look at the past and what was leading up to the Holocaust to understand what's happening today and why decisions like this would be made. What was life like for Jewish people?
You're asking a terrific question. And the reason you're asking a terrific question is because of our responsibility right now to tell what happened between 1919 and 1933 before the Nazis came to power. And the reason we have to do that is because we have to understand how democracy becomes fragile and how also democracy can ultimately yield to to an authoritarian and then a totalitarian state. So let's deal with Germany was defeated in World War One. It was defeated essentially because it ran out of food and it ran out of gasoline and it ran out of rubber. You cannot, if you have a population that cannot be fed, ultimately any country has to come to some sort of an arrangement to feed its population. You can't field an army without gasoline and rubber for tires, gasoline to run trucks and to bring material and logistics to the fore. Germany was not prepared for defeat, and therefore they wanted to blame someone for defeat. They also became essentially punished by the Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty got rid of some lands that Germany had previously had at its own and imposed tremendous penalty on them. In the early 1920s, Germany had inflation. But we think of inflation in American terms, you have to think of inflation that you needed wheelbarrows of money to buy a piece of bread. You had to pay people twice a day because if you didn't pay them twice a day, by the time you paid them at the end of the day, their money was worthless. You had inflation not of 10%, not of 5%, but not of 100%, but of 1,000%. You even had to make a multi-billion-dollar currency because that's how worthless the money became. That wiped out the middle class. Along comes Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler in 1923 was arrested for a putsch, for an attempted overthrow of the government. He was imprisoned in Landsberg, and there he wrote something called Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf told us that he had two goals. His goal in coming to power in Germany was German expansionism, to make Germany like America. He admired America going from sea to shining sea, and he wanted to expand Germany within Europe. It no longer could colonize. It lost its colonies in the third world. It therefore was going to colonize Europe, most especially Poland, where there were going to be workers to propel German industry, and Ukraine, because Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. The second goal was racial. And with all due respect to Whoopi Goldberg, it was racial, meaning that he wanted to establish Germany as the dominant, the master race, with a series of subordinate races, including the Poles, anybody from the Slavic countries, And then he wanted to eliminate the Jews whom he regarded as a cancer. So once you define people as a cancer, let's take, and you'll forgive me, I'm going to be a little bit graphic. If I walked in to a woman and removed her left breast, I would be considered a mutilator. If I have a coat and I'm a physician, I say, I'm sorry to tell you, but you have cancer and you need a mastectomy, I'm a healer. If you define the Jews as a cancer, then their elimination becomes what they call healing by killing, meaning you're protecting the German nation. He first thought he would do that by elimination, meaning expelling the Jews, getting the Jews to leave German space. And then over time, he came to the view that the only way to get rid of the Jews was what was then called extermination, what we mean annihilation, murder, etc. Having said that, they became the central focus. They were a people who were not only not worthy of living, but dangerous if they were alive. And this became the central thrust of an entire racial doctrine. Now, when I worked, as I work in this field, I always include the totality of Nazi victims because he victimized many groups. He victimized trade. He started with trade unionists, political dissidents, social democrats, communists. He victimized gays, gay men, not women, because there was a statement even lesbian wombs can breed the master race. He victimized Poles. He victimized people of Slavic nations. He victimized the handicapped, those of special needs, what they defined as, and hear the words because they give you a chill, life unworthy of living and useless eaters. But the full thrust of his murderous programs became directed at the Jews, and that's the essence of the Holocaust. We have to understand something else. This was done by the most cultured, by the most advanced, by the country with the greatest musical tradition, the greatest artist tradition, greatest literary tradition, the greatest philosophical tradition. It was done by an elite country by every standard of human civilization. Therefore, it implicates the totality of Western civilization, and it has important parts. What is Hitler's major thing is he was looking for a scapegoat. And he chose a scapegoat called the Jews, and he could build on centuries of tradition of anti-Semitism and essentially push for their annihilation. Now, if somebody like the NEA wants to forget about talking about Jews, ask them how the hell they can write an honest history.
Besides the idea of it not being an honest history, is it alarming to you because it has echoes of Nazi Germany in a way? Because why would it want to be done by the National Education Association? What would their goal be in doing that?
Well, let me begin by saying I think their goal essentially is their Jews right now are making them uncomfortable. And they're making them uncomfortable because of Israel. They're making them uncomfortable because of Gaza. They're making them uncomfortable for any number of reasons. But if you're serious about education, then you don't rewrite the past. You grapple, you struggle, you wrestle with the present, but you don't rewrite history. Otherwise, there is no such thing as history, because you're essentially so they are essentially politicizing history. They're engaged in historical revisionism. It is essentially Holocaust denial in not in a big sense, but in a small sense, and all because they don't want to deal with Jews. And one can say that that is forcing them to violate what should be the major ethical standards of their profession. And I don't even want to yet call it anti-Semitism. I'm just saying you got to ask a question. Why would a group that is supposedly committed to teaching the past and to teaching honestly and honorably and to teaching accurately and in a manner that is historically responsible, why would they violate all of those principles if there was not a sense of, I don't know their motivations, I can't prove the motivations, but one of the things you have to think of is perhaps there's quite a bit of anti-Semitism that would make them bend over backwards to violate everything they supposedly stand for.
In other words, if they stand for standing up for the oppressed, they have to remove Jews from being oppressed.
They have to remove them. That let's presume they are removing them, so they are essentially violating the canons of their profession. And that why would you violate the canons of your profession if you're a moral organization with serious standards of of learning and scholarship, and you proclaim yourself to be an organization of educators? Why would you miseducate, and why would you participate in something like that? So I have no evidence that they're anti-Semitic. I have every conceivable reason to suspect that they are. And in the name of an ideology, I don't want to even define the ideology, they're willing to falsify the past. Well, I'm willing to confront the problems of the present without falsifying the past. Again, I think it's a series of activists who are looking at handbooks. Uh, and the other part of it is we have to ask this serious question: why would you violate all of the commitments to honorably and honestly teaching the past, unless you have an ideological conviction that you want to describe history in a different way? Now, again, if you begin to treat Jews as congratulations, Jews, you're white, now that means you are privileged and oppressors, it may be uncomfortable for you to describe Jews who were not privileged oppressors, but who were victimized, oppressed, especially if you believe that virtue belongs to the oppressed, or virtue is monopolized by the oppressed. But there is no question that in the Holocaust, the Jews were the primary victim, that all of the institutions of the German government and all of its ideology were directed to the elimination of the Jews, first by self-deportation, then by expulsion, finally by systematic structural persecution, discrimination, and finally by systematic murder that had two stages. So I don't understand where the NEA would come off doing this. And whoever is doing it, I don't want in control of any historical curriculum, because they obviously are rewriting history, politicizing history. I don't want that done by the right. I don't want that done by the left. I don't want that done by the center. I want my kids to be taught and my grandchildren to be taught by people who are committed to telling the historical truth as best we know it. And I think I know a little bit about this historical truth. And I think that the little that I know tells me that you can't eliminate the Jews from the center of the Nazi ideological policies to the elimination of the Jewish population between 1933 and 45 that we regard as the Holocaust.
Why do you think it didn't make very much news?
Look, I attribute that to the fact that there are so many issues that are making the news that, and the other part of it is there may be people who share that ideology, who didn't want to publicize it. And it could be that the NEA is less important than it thinks it is in doing such a thing because it couldn't even call attention to what it's doing. So there are multiple reasons, but I think once you call attention to it, then you have to say attention must be paid, and this is quite outrageous.
What would you say could be done for people that did notice it and are upset by it and can see how it could be a very big deal?
If I remember the NEA, I would ask its leadership how they can justify this. I would ask its leadership what historical sources they use to justify it. I would ask them what's their discomfort in saying the word Jew as a victim. I would ask them why they want to join what the Soviet Union tried to do, which is just to de-Judaize it. And the other thing is, let's remember the Nazis told us what they wanted to do. They told us as they were doing it what they wanted to do. They did not deny what they were doing. They said it out and openly all the way through. So let's presume that the NEA is acting in all innocence, and I'm not presuming that, but let's ask the question. Uh, Tell me, what do you know that I don't know about the Holocaust, and what are you relying upon to eliminate the word Jews? Where's your authority? What historical documents are you using? Oh, you mean to tell me you don't have historical documents? Or you mean to tell me you're uncomfortable with the word Jew or with the way in which Israel is behaving in Gaza? Tell us that. Don't rewrite the past to suit your ideology of the present. Let's argue out the Gaza issue, but let's regard as settled truth the issue of what the Holocaust was about.
Is there anything about today, as far as anti-Semitism is concerned, that makes you extra anxious because of the element of the Ivy League schools or the NEA being so involved in things like this? Well, how does that make you feel? How do you feel it's connected to
Well,
the
you you,
past?
you have to ask. People say the best solution to anti-Semitism is education. Depends what type of education. Because Germany, you look. Let's take a character. I deal in the large picture of history, but also in the minutia history. Um, the leader of one of the Einsatzgruppen was a man by the name of Otto Ohlendorf. Otto Ohlendorf had not one PhD, but two doctorates. He was one of the leading economic theorists, and he was a man who one would have imagined would have gone on to greater degrees of prominence all the way through. He led a group that murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews. And he did so knowingly using all of the skills and all of the tools of his own education to precisely do that. And when he was tried in the subsequent trials of Nuremberg. He was convicted by his own writings, meaning the reports he submitted to Berlin on the activities of his group. There was a meeting on January 20th, 1942, called the Wannsee Conference. It was a conference at which all of the number two, and I'm being gender specific here, I'm going to say men, because all of these were male leaders at that point. It's not to say that women didn't perpetrate, but at that moment in history, the 15 men gathered around the table were all male. They were mostly the number two men in the ministries and in the areas. You had the foreign ministry, you had the justice ministry, you had the interior ministry, you had the military represent, you had the occupation policies. 8 of the 15 men gathered around the table had doctorates. They were what in my generation we called the best and the brightest, got us into Vietnam, as it were. So they weren't uneducated. These were not barbarians. They used all of the tools of an educated class to create a barbarous policy. The chemicals with which the Jews were destroyed, Zyklon B, were designed by very competent chemists who discovered another use for this. I have seen the blueprints for the gas chambers. Blueprints for the gas chambers were done by highly competent architects. The engineers who built the crematoria understood what they were building, because we have in every town and community, we have crematoria, because we there are people who are cremated, but they designed the crematoria not to preserve the sanctity of the individual's ashes. Because if somebody cremates their father, their mother, their brother, their sister, their spouse, or God forbid, 100 times over, their child, they don't want everybody's ashes. They want what? The ashes of their loved one. They designed crematoria that mixed the ashes. They knew what they were doing. They even registered certain things for patents and all of that. So it depends on what your education is, and whether your education includes a value education, and a value education that again builds toward tolerance, pluralism, mutual acceptance, and all of that, and whether you really believe in the sanctity of every human being, and the notion that we expanded in the American Declaration, not that all men are created equal, but all people are created equal, and there are certain inalienable rights to life and liberty, and the like. These are fundamental values. Or if you're religious, that human beings are created in the image of God, and to murder a human being is to murder the image of God. So depends what your education brings about and what your education goes for. So I'm always interested, and this is why the NEA doing what they're doing is more frightening to me, because it's the quality of education that is one of the bedrocks of society. And when teachers use themselves to pursue an ideological gain, they create enormous dangers for our society.
One of the most alarming things, and all the things that have happened in the past year or so, and there's been a lot of them.
Children are transformable. Uh, we always say a child is not born hating. A child is not born knowing that there are categories of race or religion. A child is not born. A child you want to educate, you want to raise good children, teach them essentially that they're loved, they're sacred, and that they exist in community, that they're protected, and all of that. And but some societies raise their children on dosage of hatred and dosage of discrimination, and again raise them with language that demeans and destroys.
It's also alarming to me because it's almost like we're watching some things happen in slow motion. You almost feel a little bit helpless.
And deterioration doesn't happen all at once. Deterioration happens over time, and it's not like society immediately has a heart attack. It's that you have a gradual erosion of standards, a gradual erosion of decency, a gradual uptick of hatred. You have people who are essentially think that in the name of their ideology they can rewrite history, who don't feel a responsibility as they educate. And again, here, if they wanted to debate the Gaza issue, that's a fair debate. It's an open debate. But to eliminate the word Jew from the Holocaust, um, as a historian, I feel a certain sense of pity. I mean, that's foolishness, that's stupidity, that's irresponsibility, that's contemptible in a very real way. And unfitting for people who claim themselves to be educators.
I guess that's coming full circle to the beginning of this conversation, why I was really interested in talking about Germany pre-Holocaust, pre-World War II, to describe exactly what you're saying, that society doesn't have a heart attack in 1 hour. It happens over a progressive time period. And for the Jews in Germany, they had one life for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden it was another life.
Think of the following image, which helps you in a very interesting way. If you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, the frog jumps out. If you heat the water up slowly, the frog will stay in until the water boils and they're dead. Because people always ask, when did Jews know it was time to leave? And the fact that and different people knew at different times it was time to leave. But think of the image of the frog. In other words, if you came into Germany unknowingly in 1942, when they're rounding up the Germany or German occupied territory, when they're rounding up the Jews for deportation, you sure as hell know you got to get the hell out, go anywhere else imaginable. If you come in and you see it heat up slowly, you would have greater hesitancy. When do you know? And this is one of the symptoms of the erosion of society. And I don't think the NEA sees itself as that, but they are politicizing history. They're not telling the truth. And they are also losing confidence of serious professionals in their capacity to teach the truth, which undermines the NEA.
This seems like a good place to maybe wrap up, Dr. Berenbaum. I really enjoyed our conversation. I enjoyed meeting you.
Thank you for having me.